Johnny Talk Sports with the Week 9 college football predictions. Last week I went 8-2, but I'm on a hot streak here. The last 2 weeks, in Week 7 I went 11-0, and last week I went 8-2. So a combined record of 19-2 in the last 2 weeks. Hopefully I can keep my hot streak going here with Week 9. But before I get to that, I have an updated top 10. I decided to include my top 10 in the predictions videos from here on out. That way it can save me some time and you guys a lot of time as well. So my top 10 is as follows. At number 1, I have the LSU Tigers. And the LSU Tigers have the best resume out of anyone in college football right now. A road win against Texas and a win against Florida at home by 14 points. So that is a big resume for LSU to have. And they're going to have the chance to get even more resume points and the ability to build on that resume a lot more this weekend against Auburn, who right now is at 9th in the country. So LSU could possibly get another big win against a top 10 team, because you got to remember, Texas was around that top 10 when LSU beat them. At number 2, I have the Ohio State Buckeyes. And the Buckeyes, their offense is just firing on all cylinders. When Ohio State is at their best, I think they're the biggest threat to win the national championship. Ohio State, I think, is one of the best offenses in college football. In fact, LSU, Ohio State, even a lot of teams around in this top 5, 6, a lot of dynamic offenses in the country. But Ohio State has a convincing win against Cincinnati in dominating fashion. In fact, the more Cincinnati wins, the more Ohio State's going to win at the end of the day. I had the Buckeyes at number 2 because at 3 and 4, both these teams, they don't really have as big of a resume right now as Ohio State. But I see now that I can see why lots of people think that Clemson is overrated at this point. I can see why. Because Clemson had a slow start this week, but they came back and dominated. At number 3, I have the Alabama Crimson Tide. And Tua Tagovailoa was the biggest story for Alabama this past weekend, leaving the game early with an ankle injury. And Tua's going to miss a couple of weeks, but probably only one game, though. Because Alabama, they play Arkansas this weekend, which I really don't think is going to be that big of a deal. Although any given Saturday, though, I don't think it's going to be a big deal for Alabama. I still think they're going to be able to beat Arkansas. Alabama can beat Arkansas just by running the football. They really could. And that's what I think is going to happen. I think Alabama is just going to keep feeding Najee Harris all game long. And Robinson, too. They'll feed those two plenty of times, and Alabama will probably win, but at the bare minimum, by 24-28. But then Alabama has the bye week, which leads into the big showdown in Tuscaloosa between LSU. So I have Alabama at number 3. At number 4, I have Clemson. And yes, Clemson, I think you could possibly consider Clemson being the number 1 team. In fact, Clemson did get quite a few first place votes in the AP poll. But Clemson right now doesn't have that big of a resume. In fact, the North Carolina narrow escape, it's starting to not look good for Clemson the further on the season goes. But Clemson, they do have an easy route to the college football playoff. If Clemson loses a game, they could be in danger of missing the college football playoff. But I think it has to depend on what other one-loss teams are going to be involved in the conversation. So Clemson at number 4 right now in my rankings. And if this was the 4, if this ended up being the Final Four, the playoff, LSU would face off against Clemson, and LSU would probably choose, I think they'll choose to go to Atlanta, while Ohio State and Alabama would duke it out in Glendale. So that is the top 4 at this point. Now, 5 and 6, these are the first 2 out. And I think if they win out, this could be a heated debate here, depending on how things shape out the rest of the season. At number 5, I have Penn State. Penn State climbs into my top 5. They had a convincing win in Happy Valley this past Saturday night in prime time over Michigan. But does that win against Michigan, will it begin to not look as impressive later on when we get to the season? Because beating a team where they are happen to be positioned when you play them is one thing, but it's how that team progresses is another factor. And I think if Michigan, they end up losing 2 more games, it may not look as impressive by the end of the season. But I think if Penn State wins out, they'll get in. I think any undefeated team should deserve to get in that's not a Power 5 team. At number 6, the Oklahoma Sooners. Now, it was kind of hard to take Oklahoma out of the top 5, but I just think Penn State, they've just been convincing these last 2 weeks. Going on the road in Kinnick Stadium against Iowa, which is a very tough place to play, and beating Michigan in primetime. So 2 primetime games in a row. I think that's impressive for a team like Penn State. And Oklahoma at 6. They do have the win against Texas, but it's the same Texas team that needed a game-winning field goal to escape from Kansas. So it may not look as impressive towards the end of the season. At number 7, this is kind of where the controversy kind of sets in, because right now it's about which one-loss team is the best one-loss team in the country. So at number 7, I have Florida. And the reason why I have Florida is because I think their one loss is the best out of anyone's. I think Florida, with their one loss, with it being to LSU, who I have at number 1, I feel like that's the best loss you can have. And if Florida can win out, maybe we could see Florida and LSU rematch in the SEC championship game. So I have the Gators at 7. At number 8, I have the Georgia Bulldogs, and at 9, I have the Auburn Tigers. Now, you could argue and maybe flip these, but I don't really want to move Auburn up that much, because Auburn, they had somewhat of a bye week this past week. It was just Arkansas. So you could argue and say Auburn could be 8 and then Georgia be 9. But I think Georgia, they just had the off day in South Carolina. Because even though Georgia, they looked really weak against Kentucky, they really dominated in the second half of that game. And I think Georgia could, right now at the moment, they could beat Auburn, I think. Number 9, Auburn. I didn't want to move up Auburn like too many spots, because I know the rankings were going to shuffle because Wisconsin lost, and it just caused a huge ripple effect in the range of 7 through 10. But Auburn at 9. And rounding out my top 10 is the Oregon Ducks. And simply, Oregon, they did pick up a convincing victory over Washington on the road, which is a very tough place to play as well. One of, if not the toughest places to play in the Pac-12. Probably the second toughest place to play behind Autzen Stadium. And Oregon is not 9. Auburn's ahead of Oregon because of that head-to-head matchup that Auburn has over the Ducks. So that is my top 10. Now let's get into the Week 9 college football predictions. We start with the Miami Hurricanes and the Pittsburgh Panthers. The Panthers are really surprising me this season. They played pretty close with Penn State, who I have as the number 5 team in the country. They pulled off the ups against UCF. They ended their winning streak. But right now, Miami, it just looks like up and down. It seems like night and day with these Hurricanes. And I'm going to pick the Panthers because right now I feel like it's just night for the Hurricanes. I don't think it's going to go well for them. I like Pittsburgh's momentum and confidence going into this game. I'm taking the Panthers. Next, we have Penn State, who the AP has number 6, versus Michigan State. Now, at the beginning of the season, in preseason, I talked about how Penn State has a grueling October schedule. And right now, they are passing the test. They're not only passing it, but they're acing the test of October. and I think they're going to continue to be acing this. Michigan State has been one of the disappointments, if not the biggest disappointment, in college football this season. And I think it's just going to get worse for these Spartans. I'm going to pick Penn State to continue the momentum. Next, we have number 15 Texas and TCU. Texas, I talked about earlier how they needed a late field goal to get past Kansas. And TCU's also kind of disappointing so far this season. A loss last week to Kansas State. They lost to SMU, which is not looking too bad at this point because SMU, right now with Boise State losing, they are right now the front runner for that group of 5 bowl bid. So this one, I think, even though it may not look like a close matchup on paper, it really does look like a close matchup when you think about it. And I'm going to pick the Longhorns in this, but this is probably going to be one of those picks this week where I look back on it and regret it because TCU is going to pull off a magic play at the end of the game that leads them to victory. So I'm going to take the Longhorns, but this will probably be the pick I look back on and regret it. Next, we have Maryland and number 17 Minnesota. Minnesota still undefeated, but are they a legitimate team? I think they have the potential to be. I think they are at this point because for Minnesota to be undefeated at this point in the season, I feel like it's remarkable. But I think Minnesota, they're going to get their reality check eventually. But I just don't think it's going to be this week. I just think Minnesota, right now, Maryland, if you would have had this matchup about maybe 4 weeks ago, I'd say Maryland would probably win this game. But now, since we're in week 9, Maryland had an explosive offense the first 2 weeks of the season, got a reality check against Temple, and it's been a big reality check ever since. And Maryland has just been completely on the decline since week 3. And I'm going to take the Gophers to stay undefeated. Next, we have Oklahoma State versus number 23 Iowa State. Iowa State back in the top 25. Well, Oklahoma State, they are coming off of a blowout loss to Baylor in a really ugly game. But Oklahoma State, they competed hard, but they just let the game get away from them in the fourth quarter. Now, I've gone to the Oklahoma State well multiple times this season, and I've come up empty. So I'm not going to go to the Oklahoma State well for a third time this season. I'm going to go to the Iowa State well, and hopefully I can pull up a win from the Iowa State well. So I'm going to take the Cyclones to win this matchup against Oklahoma State because I think Oklahoma State, I think they're losing their confidence a little bit. Yes, it's a young team, and I think they're going to have a bright future, but right now this just doesn't look like the year for the Cowboys. Next, UCF and Temple. Temple's trying to recover from a loss last week against SMU. Really ugly game, by the way, but that was one of my picks I had correct with SMU blowing out Temple. But UCF, I've picked UCF, I think, probably 4 times this season, and I've only gotten a win from UCF once, I think, once or twice. But I'm going to go to the UCF well one more time this season. I'm going to take the Knights to beat Temple. I think they're a little bit broken at this point, especially by getting blown out the way they did against SMU. I'm going to take the Knights, but maybe for the last time this season, though, depending on what happens. Next, we have Washington State and number 11 Oregon. I think this is going to be the underrated good matchup of the week. Anthony Gordon, who's leading the nation in passing yards against this Oregon defense. Now, I was close to picking an upset here. I feel like if there's going to be an upset within this top 12, or even in my case, a top 10, it's going to be right here. Because Oregon, they had to come back last week against Washington from 14 down in the second half to beat the Huskies. But since this game is in Autzen Stadium at night in prime time, well, over here in the Midwest and even the East Coast or wherever, other than the West Coast, Pac-12 after dark. and Autzen Stadium, as I covered earlier, that it's the loudest place to play in the Pac-12 and the most difficult place to play. I'm going to take the Ducks, although it wouldn't surprise me if Anthony Gordon just completely went off against this Oregon defense. Next, number 8 Notre Dame versus Michigan. Now this is a matchup that preseason was one of the biggest matchups of the season, but now that Michigan has struggled this season, it doesn't look as an exciting matchup as it did earlier in the season, because this was one of the top 10 matchups to look forward to in preseason, but it just doesn't look like that anymore. Notre Dame's coming off a bye week. Michigan's trying to recover from a heartbreaking loss against Penn State last week, but I just think the Irish coming off a bye week is going to help them out. And even though Michigan's unranked right now, if Notre Dame can beat Michigan in the Big House, I feel like that's good enough to earn some resume points, even though Michigan's not ranked right now, and it really may not mean anything. But I think Notre Dame getting a win in the Big House would really do wonders for this Irish team. I'm going to take Notre Dame because they're coming off a bye week, so they had an extra week of rest, and they got to watch the Penn State tape and how to shut down Michigan. I'm going to take the Irish. And we have two big matchups left to predict this week, the two biggest ones. I always like to save the best ones for last. Next, number 13 Wisconsin versus number 3 Ohio State. Now this is very disappointing, and I'm not disappointed in the matchup. I'm just disappointed that it's not really as built up as it was 2 weeks ago. Since Wisconsin went to Champaign and they lost to the Illini, Wisconsin just beat themselves. Well, they got beat by two teams this past Saturday. They got beat by the Illini, and they got beat by themselves. All they had to do in that last drive, that last offensive drive they had, was to just hand the ball off to Jonathan Taylor. That's literally all they had to do. You have probably one of, if not the best running back in college football, and you don't hand the ball off to him in the final possession that you have on offense. That's just ridiculous play calling for Wisconsin. I felt like Wisconsin deserved to lose that game. Especially when you're going to lose the turnover battle to Illinois, you deserve to lose. And right now, this could have been a top 5 matchup. It really could have been. But we can't have nice things. So it's 13 versus 3. And things will just get from bad to worse for the Badgers. Because, yes, both these teams, they are 1 and 2 in scoring defense in college football, but you got to look at who Wisconsin has actually played. Yes, they have 4 shutouts this season, but you got to look at who they're against. They are against South Florida. They are against Central Michigan. They're against Michigan State, which I can give them credit for that one, but Michigan State's offense has just looked completely anemic for the last 2 to 3 years now. And against Kent State. Right now, Wisconsin, I'm going to say it. The Badgers are frauds at this point. Their team is a fraud. They're one of the fakest teams in college football. Because all their team is at this point is Jonathan Taylor and some defense. But this defense, they haven't played a good team yet this season. Yes, Wisconsin is number 1 in scoring defense. I get that. I get the shutouts and everything. But this is going to be the toughest team that Wisconsin is going to play. And Ohio State is going to expose Wisconsin. Ohio State is going to expose that Wisconsin defense by running with J.K. Dobbins and Master Teague right through the Badgers defense. Ohio State's going to win this game, and they're going to win this big. Ohio State's going to win this by at least 17 points. Yeah, I'm sorry, but that's just how it's going to be. Wisconsin's going to get the reality check they need. Wisconsin, they had a reality check against Illinois, but this is just going to be a much more humbling experience for the Badgers. Because part of the reason why the Badgers probably lost last week was they were looking ahead to this matchup. And eventually it's going to hurt Wisconsin in the near future if they can't find a better quarterback to recruit. Wisconsin's just going to turn into running back university, which is a good thing, but they're not going to have a quarterback that can lead them to winning championships. So I'm going to take the Buckeyes to win by at least 17 points, 17-24. Next, well, finally, we have the game of the week. The number 9 Auburn Tigers and who the AP thinks is number 2, the LSU Tigers, who I think is the number 1 team in the country. So this is going to be an exciting matchup. Auburn has an opportunity to get right back into the college football playoff race with a win here in Death Valley. In fact, if Auburn could pull off the upset against LSU in Death Valley, I think Auburn could easily jump up to the best one-loss team in college football. So Auburn could jump up from 9 to probably 5 if they can win this week. But the question is, Bo Nix is going on the road, and he couldn't lead Auburn to victory in the Swamp. He did in Kyle Field, but right now it's looking like that win in Kyle Field isn't looking as good as it originally was, because Texas A&M has been mediocre all season long. And right now, Auburn has to go into Death Valley to take on the Tigers. And Joe Burrow is the co-Heisman favorite at this point. I think if they can force LSU to run this football, if they can completely shut down this passing game, Joe Burrow's passing game, I like the Tigers' chances of winning. But the way I see it, I think LSU uses the home crowd to their advantage. I think LSU wins this game, but it may not be as convincing as past LSU victories. LSU has 2 dominant victories over Texas and Florida, and LSU gets a third one, but I think it's going to be very close. I'm going to say 27-23. I think it'll be a very close game. I think Joe Burrow, he may have a little bit of an off day, but he'll make the plays needed to win this game. So those are my Week 9 college football predictions. Like, share, and subscribe. And I will see you in my next video. NFL predictions coming up pretty soon. NBA predictions. So stay tuned for that. It's going to be good.